So, welcome everyone to this evening session. This is our second training session on ultra wide. Um, and we've got Mr. Browning again. Thank you very much for joining us again and running this whole series.
You.
I'm going to leave everything to him. Like I said, this session has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Please do write any questions you have in the chat, and then we can raise them at the end. And that was it. I'll be quiet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And hello again, everybody. Lovely to be with you once again. And I'll just bring that up there. That's lovely. Okay, so before we start this evening, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of you who were at the last session. Had some really nice feedback from that, and so that was very nice to see. One of the bits of feedback in that was that people were saying it'd be nice to have some more case studies within the lecture. Just to let you know, these first two lectures are sort of introductory type lectures. The next three talks that we're doing are drilling down far more into very specific retinal disorders and things like that. There'll be a lot more case studies and things like that for you to get your teeth into. So do not worry, they're round the corner waiting for you. So that was just to sort of give you some feedback on your feedback. Thank you very much. So tonight is about autofluorescent retinal imaging, which is part of the ultra wide field system analytical tools that are in there. Autofluorescent imaging is, to me, one of the most exciting things that ever happened in modern optometry. And I think, as I might have mentioned in the last lecture, it completely revolutionized the way that I was dealing with my patients. And I want to sort of share with you tonight some of that reasoning, and again, give you a taste for what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at some retinal conditions in an autofluorescent mode, but we'll be looking far more at those in the future as we go. So you'll see the title tonight is Autofluorescent Retinal Imaging, the Game Changer in Modern Primary Eye Healthcare Delivery. And that's really what it was to me. And the reason for this is that although it's called a novel way of viewing the retina, the reason is that the images that we generally look at in life, be it through an ophthalmoscope, be it through a bio headset, a Volk lens, fundus camera, all of the OCT even, all of these images are structural images. They're looking at the actual structure of the retina, the sort of classic type of image that we see there. Now, this is the first image that I ever took using autofluorescence. And I think, as might have been said last time, I was lucky enough to be the first person literally in the world to use autofluorescent imaging in the high street setting. And this was the very first patient that I imaged. Now, he came to see me completely asymptomatic, routine eye test, and this was the image that I took of his retina. And as far as I was concerned, to all intents and purposes, structurally, it looked absolutely fine. But autofluorescence is looking at the functionality of the retina. And I'm going to go on to explain what I mean by that during the evening. But when we look at the functionality, when we look at the autofluorescent image, it shows me something completely different to what the structural image shows. There it looks normal. Here it is most definitely not normal. There is something happening here. Now, these are angioid streaks, and one of the first things that autofluorescence taught me is that angioid streaks are incredibly common. And I will be honest with you, I wouldn't have thought that prior to autofluorescence. But often when you look at a patient with dry macular degeneration, you will see the whole of that macular area is crisscrossed with angioid streaks extensions. And in this set of angioid streaks here, there's a tiny little one there. And that is probably one of the most important ones on that image, because that's pointing straight up towards the fovea. And consequently, if these are allowed to develop and grow throughout life, they are going to invade the macular region, and so often seen in association with early dry macular degeneration. And so this already sends the warning out that what we're dealing with here is the way that the retina metabolizes waste products, and how do we keep a healthy environment within that retina. So when we look at an autofluorescent image, we're looking at two completely different things. The structural image is the color one, and the autofluorescent one is the functionality one. And often autofluorescence will show you things in a completely different way to the traditional view, and often much, much earlier when the retina is just stressed as opposed to structurally compromised. So fundus autofluorescence, so it's not a new technology. It's actually been around for over 40 years now. It was first utilized in sort of living eyes in about 1995. And with the introduction of confocal scanning devices, it allowed us to be able to use it in a clinical setting. There is a big sort of physics science reasoning behind it in terms of the light sources that negated the normal fluorescence within the human lens, which allows us to get to the retina and see things clearly. So it was in 2011 Optos introduced the autofluorescent imaging in their new Daytona device, which, as I say, I was lucky enough to have the first one of those. Now, when we talk about what I call high street autofluorescent imaging, we're really talking about two different modalities. There's one that utilizes a blue wavelength of light around 488 nanometers, and you'll see that mostly in the Heidelberg OCT family of things. And then you've got those that utilize the green wavelength imaging around 532 nanometers, and that's what you'll see in the Optos ultra wide field family. Now, I think if you went to anybody who's a fan of Heidelberg, they'll tell you the blue wavelength is definitely better. If you went to anybody who's into the Optos family, they'll tell you the green wavelengths are better. Both are good, both achieve what we want them to achieve. It has been shown in quite a few papers that have been published that the green light images are superior for accurate determination of small changes, central pathologic changes, and central sort of atrophic lesion definition. So I will hold my hand up and say I'm a fan of the green wavelength, but you will see it in two. And there are different types of autofluorescence sort of coming to the fore nowadays. Near infrared autofluorescence is quite exciting because this one is causing, with the wavelength, it is causing us to get fluorescence from the melanin within the retinal pigment epithelial cells. So we're looking at it's a different fluorophore to lipofuscin, and it's showing us different types of cell stress as well. So near infrared certainly is one to look out for. And then this thing called quantitative autofluorescence, which again is exciting because it standardizes all the results you're getting. It corrects the intensities for different camera settings. It allows for media opacities, and it allows for very, very reliable comparison across visits by a patient and also between individuals. So for a scientific setting, for a research setting, quantitative autofluorescence is absolutely essential. Now, neither of these two types of autofluorescence are actually readily available in the high street setting yet, but undoubtedly, especially near infrared, will be coming forward into the high street. And it shows what people now see as the value of that autofluorescence brings. So what is autofluorescent imaging? The definition is a system of viewing the retina utilizing the properties of degraded photoreceptor outer segment discs. That is a mighty mouthful. So I'm going to explain it to you in the way that I devised to explain to patients. So it is a very basic explanation, but I think it explains it rather nicely. If you think of every rod and cone in your retina as a pile of CDs with a lollipop stick stuck on the top. Now, what happens is light comes in and hits the pile of CDs, and the energy within that photon of light causes lots and lots of things to happen in the pile of CDs. But one of the things it does is damage the stack of CDs with just the pure level of energy. So it is important that we've got a good, healthy stack of CDs. So every day, 10% of that stack of CDs drops off into the retinal pigment epithelium where it's broken down and disposed of, and the lollipop stick produces a new 10% at the top. So if you think about it, the stack of outer segment discs, which are absolutely essential for vision, every 10 to 11 days, they are completely changed. And that goes on from the second you're born till the second you die. Throughout the whole of life, this constant changing every 10 days of all the outer segment discs in every rod and cone in your retina goes on. And it's absolutely vital that it does that, because if you drop 10% off but don't produce a new 10%, the rod or cone will shorten and will cease to function. If you produce more at the top but don't get rid of them at the bottom, it'll lengthen and it'll cease to function. So it's absolutely vital that that dynamic relationship goes on throughout the whole of life. And it doesn't just happen randomly. And that's the beauty of it. It's a diurnal activity. During the day, the rods tend to shed their outer segment discs because they're not active in the level of light that's there. And in the night, in lower light levels, the cones do the same trick. And again, because they're not actually working in the purpose of producing sight, because there's just not enough light there. And it's the breakdown of these waste discs at the retinal pigment epithelial level that gives rise to lipofuscin through phagocytosis. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. And you build lipofuscin over time. And what we're looking at with an autofluorescent image is the fluorescence of the lipofuscin. And so when you're looking at bright areas on an autofluorescent image, you're looking at probable excess lipofuscin and hence active retinal distress or damage. And this is really important because the cell's still metabolizing, but it's building up this toxic waste product inside its cytoplasm. So the cell's becoming more and more toxic over time. So that brightness is the cell sort of screaming at you and saying, help me, I'm not feeling good, I'm in trouble. And there's where we get an opportunity to intervene at that stage. Now, if you've seen dark areas, that's a bit more serious, because either you're looking at something where the instant light gets absorbed, like blood, and the blood vessels therefore, or you're looking at an area where no lipofuscin is being produced anymore, is dead. There is no metabolism. So you're looking at retinal atrophy, or as I prefer to call it with patients, cellular dropout, because that's all a little bit less distressing to a patient. So I would say bright is a warning sign to you, dark is a sign of death. So they're the two very, very simple ways of looking at it. But I want to spend a little while looking at the retinal pigment epithelium, because this is, to me, one of the most staggering parts of the human body. It just, believe it or not, it really excites me. And when I started looking into this, I could lecture on this to you for 4 or 5 hours tonight if you wanted, and we would still barely scratch the surface of it. But if you really want to get into the microbiology of all of it and the chemistry behind it, please do read up on it, because without the retinal pigment epithelium, we do not see. It's as simple as that. And it is a single layer of cells. This is what's so fascinating. It's one cell layer thick. That's all it is. And without that one cell layer thick layer, we would not see. That's how fantastic it is. And it does so many things. It's a very, very highly specialized structure within the body. Now, you can see just a list of some of the things that it does here. It absorbs scattered light to improve the crispness of our vision. It transports substances in and out to the retinal elements like the rods and cones. It buffers the ionic compounds so we don't move too acid or too alkaline. And it contributes to the workings of the visual cycle. And remember, the visual cycle is basically what produces the electrical impulse by converting other rhodopsin, iodopsin, and creating the electrical impulse that travels up each nerve into the visual cortex, and we see. So without the visual cycle, nothing happens. But without the retinal pigment epithelium, the visual cycle doesn't happen. And very, very responsible for secretion of waste and something known as maintenance of the immune privilege. Now, basically, nothing gets into or out of the eye unless it goes via the retinal pigment epithelium there. And therefore, you've got a barrier to the blood. So if you do have a tumour within the eye or something like that, you haven't got direct access to the lymph system because of this immune privilege. So it's a really, really important thing here. So it does all of those things, but today we're going to sort of major on phagocytosis of the outer discs of the receptors, because it is that process that gives rise to lipofuscin, which gives rise to the autofluorescent image that we can see. So the retinal pigment epithelium is located between the outer segments of those photoreceptors and the blood supply of the choroid. As you can see from this histological stain slide here, they're hexagonally arranged cells, so it's a very, very strong structure. And it has what we call tight junctions on it. So nothing gets in and out of that cell through diffusion or anything like that. It has to be via active transport. And so this is how we have the immune privilege set up there. And it plays an absolutely critical role in the normal functioning of the retina. So let's have a look at a little sort of cut through here. It has a very intimate relationship. You can see here this very intimate relationship with the outer segment discs. And you get these little microvilli that grow up and around the outer segment discs. And you'll see the purpose of that in just a second. And the outer surface here, which is connected down to Bruch's membrane, has lots and lots of little folds in it to increase the surface area, so that this enables sort of greater substance exchange both into and out of the cell. Histologically, it looks dark. It appears dark, just due to the amount of melanin granules that are actually in each cell. And those melanin granules are there to, again, absorb the heat energy that is coming in from the light sources. And again, that plays a very important role in protecting the cell. And it contains a whole mass of metabolic systems. And the whole idea really with these systems is to reduce what we call the accumulation of reactive oxygen species. Now, these are elements that will cause oxidative damage within the cell. And this is the first time, really, I've mentioned the word oxidative damage. You will immediately think of the fact that when we're talking to patients about macular degeneration, change in the retina, what is the one thing we want them to talk about? Antioxidants. We're looking to fight the oxidation ability within the cells, because it is oxidation that causes the damage and causes the incomplete breakdown of these waste products, which then leads to lipofuscin formation. So we're looking all the while at maintaining the metabolic health of that cell and minimizing the amount of oxidation that's going on within the cell and the oxidative damage that's being caused within the cell. So there's about 4 to 6 million retinal pigment epithelial cells in each eye. In the middle, they're much smaller. At the periphery, around the ora serrata, they're much larger, about 60 microns in diameter. But each retinal pigment epithelial cell, wherever it is, whatever its size, is responsible for about 40 of these photoreceptor outer segments that we've just shown you in here. So you've got 40 of these, be it rods or cones, associated with each RPE cell. And they're denser in the center, where the cells are smaller and there's more rods and cones. And that's quite an important thing to consider, and we'll see that in a moment. Within there, as I said, we have melanosomes or pigment granules, and they move in and out of the cytoplasm. They're rather clever. When you open your eye in the morning and light floods in, those melanosomes will move towards the inner surface. So they're right at the top of the cell, absorbing the light that comes in straight away and absorbing the energy from that light coming in right at the top of the cell to protect the cell structures underneath from ultraviolet light damage. The trouble is they absorb all that light energy, and that causes the heating up of this layer. And you can see just what an alien environment this retinal pigment epithelium has to work in. because that RPE choroid complex heats up to over 40 degrees centigrade and it functions throughout its life at about 40 degrees centigrade. Now, if the rest of your body was functioning at 40 degrees centigrade, quite simply, it wouldn't be functioning. You'd be dead. So this is, again, a very alien environment. In that heat, you get so much more oxidation going on. You can't avoid it because of the heat. So again, this very alien environment. Well, the melanosome's incredibly important, but then we have our friend lipofuscin. And this is often referred to as the age pigment because it's considered a hallmark of aging within a cell. And lipofuscin is formed because of this oxidation process going on and the oxidative stress. And that oxidative stress affects the phagocytosis. So when you think about it, more oxidation, less efficient phagocytosis, but we must have phagocytosis to allow the outer segment discs to replenish themselves and refresh themselves. So the whole thing's in a bit of a sort of poor setup to start with. But the good news is lipofuscin possesses fluorescent capabilities. So we can see that. And this is what gives us this active look at the stress. And literally from the moment you're born to the moment you die, as I say, this lipofuscin will build within these post-mitotic cells. It'd be great if these cells could still divide, because you'd then sort of, if you think about it, you'd thin out the density of lipofuscin, just halve it each time the cell divided. But they don't divide. There is a lot of research into how we can use stem cells to change that setup and therefore help the macula. But currently, it's not really viable at the moment, although there is some progress. But therefore, you're going to get the lipofuscin building throughout life. So with age, the retinal pigment epithelium is going to undergo structural deficit change. You can't avoid it. It loses melanin and therefore it loses its ability to absorb light, and therefore you get more ultraviolet light damage to the cell. And it accumulates lipofuscin. So by the age of 70, up to 70% of the cytoplasm of every retinal pigment epithelial cell will be choked with lipofuscin. Now, I want you to just stop and think about that for a second, because if you look at ancient sort of Roman and Greek medical books and everything, you'll find macular degeneration really wasn't a problem. And the simple reason behind that was they just didn't hit 70 very often. They were all dead long before that. But nowadays, when we look at people living into their 80s, 90s and 100s, almost routinely nowadays, then if by the age of 70, you've got 70% of each retinal pigment epithelial cell chock-a-block with a toxic substance that's liable to kill the cell, what's going to happen at 80 and 90? So this is our game as optometrists, is to retain the health of the retinal pigment epithelium. And this is where when I first got involved with autofluorescent imaging, I realized as an optometrist, one of my jobs was to correct vision, and the other main job was to look for sort of health and disease within the eye. But what autofluorescent taught me very quickly was that actually my job was not just about focusing light and looking for disease. It was actually about preserving the eye, preserving the retinal pigment epithelium. Because if that's not working, we don't see. And this is a lifelong challenge. So I nowadays think one of the most important titles you can give any optometrist is vision preservationist. We're there to preserve. Once we've got the vision, then we can focus it. But we've got to preserve the functionality of the retinal pigment epithelium. And that's a lifelong battle, literally from children who got very poor diets right through to somebody in their 90s who, we want somebody at the age of 70 to have a cytoplasm with 50% lipofuscin in it, so that when they get to 90, it's gone up to 70%. We certainly, therefore, need to be looking at what happens in early life with the functionality of those retinal pigment epithelial cells. And it is about maintaining the health of that cell. And that's where we start looking at diet and lifestyle choices. We're looking at things like obesity. We're looking at whether people are smoking. We're very much looking at the effects of vaping nowadays. And we're looking at the use of antioxidants throughout life in terms of what we've got in our diet. And this starts, I've had some very interesting conversations in my life with parents of children who are morbidly obese and what they're doing to the cells, not just in their retina, but throughout the whole of their body in terms of building up waste in them. So that's where this becomes very exciting, because it's taking us into a new world of nutrition and what is good for the way the cells can metabolize within the retinal pigment epithelium. So as you see throughout life here, it demonstrates reduced antioxidant capacity just through the damage in there, and the deposits progressively develop within the RPE, and then they break down further in Bruch's membrane, and this is where you start to see drusen appearing. And some of the studies show that actually by later life, you can lose up to 50% of the RPE cell density. So you think if you've lost 50% of your retinal pigment epithelium, then those rods and cones are no longer functioning. And that's why we see such a strong association with the development of macular degeneration. So how do we get the lipofuscin formed? Well, this top diagram here, you can see how these microvilli from the retinal pigment epithelial cells here, they sort of encase the outer segment discs, and then they engulf them. And so you've got this little vesicle with these outer segment discs in it, and this is the phagosome here. And then you get lysosomal enzymes enter into the phagosome, and that's where you break down the waste products by enzymatic work. And you should, if everything was working perfectly, end up with complete digestion of those products, and you've got disposable waste product. And that would be wonderful. If every cell in the body could work that perfectly, then you probably wouldn't die. You certainly probably wouldn't get wrinkles. You certainly probably wouldn't get all those age-related things that's associated with everybody. But oxidation comes along and ruins the process. And these outer segment discs that are taken off here, because they've been damaged by the incident light, then the proteins in them and the lipids in them have been modified in that damage. And that means that they cannot be properly digested. And this is where the oxidative stress, the oxidation, means we cannot digest fully the compounds, and you get incomplete digestion. And this is, as a consequence, how the lipofuscin granules are formed. And that then interrupts what's known as exocytosis. You cannot get rid of the waste lipofuscin from the cell efficiently, and therefore lipofuscin builds in the cell. So what we're trying to do in the cytoplasm of this cell here is create the best possible environment to break down and head for complete digestion. But the oxidation damages the process. Now, if you want me to go into how the oxidation works, we can put a 2-hour lecture together on how that all does that. But do go away and read up on it if you're interested. From the point of view of the sheer practicality of it, what we know is we get lipofuscin formed, and that's what we can use. But as I say, that is what is so important about this, so that when you look at an autofluorescent image, you can see here, this is the sort of background glow you get of the lipofuscin fluorescing, but you can see in the center here this brighter area, and that's because you've got that greater density of rods and cones packed in there, and therefore you've got the greater density of lipofuscin forming. And I've thrown this little statistic in at the bottom. I love the odd statistic, but one retinal pigment epithelial cell will, throughout its life, phagocytose approximately 3 billion outer segment discs. That's quite some figure. Because if you think you've got between 4 to 6 million RPE cells in each eye, let's take 5 million as an average. 5 million times 3 billion, that's how many outer segment discs you're going to get rid of in a lifetime. That's something like 15 quadrillion, which is a big number. And that's one eye. So double it, 30 quadrillion outer segment discs get broken down and hopefully disposed of efficiently. So that's it in a single layer membrane layer of cells. It's quite mind-blowing, really. So if you like to encapsulate all of that, what we end up with is the presence of excess lipofuscin shows us hyperfluorescence, brightness, and it's evidence of stress within the cell. And although the cell is still functioning, it's still metabolizing, therefore it's still able to do the jobs like create the electrical impulse, which gives us vision. It's under stress. It's interrupted normal cellular metabolic function. So when you look at that image, when you look at an image like that there, you are looking in real time at what's going on in that retinal pigment epithelium. You are looking at the fitness of the retinal pigment epithelial layer to perform its task, and therefore to allow normal photoreceptor performance. If it doesn't look normal, then you're seeing that normal photoreceptor performance is being interrupted. And as I say, you are viewing in real time the metabolic state of the retina. And so you are looking at active stress levels in the retina. And this is not possible with your normal structural scan imaging. You can't have a clue of any of that that's going on. And that's why autofluorescence is so very, very important. And that's why we should be looking at a structural image and an autofluorescent image at the same time, because often you will see in that autofluorescent image something which you cannot see on the other image. So let's look at some causes here. So causes of hyperfluorescence. This is the excess RPE lipofuscin accumulation. So you've got very obvious ones that are reported: Stargardt's, Best's, and vitelliform macular degeneration. You often see hyperfluorescence there. And then with macular degeneration, I'm going to look at that in a bit more detail in a moment, but macular degeneration, you get hyperfluorescence around geographic atrophy areas. And these are important, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Occurrence of other fluorophores anterior or posterior to the retinal pigment epithelium. So intraretinal fluid, macular edema, subpigment epithelial fluid, drusen, lipoidal drusen hyperfluoresces. Importantly, migrated cells containing lipofuscin or melanolipofuscin, and then interesting ones like older intra or subretinal hemorrhages. So old hemorrhages will hyperfluoresce, whereas blood would normally hypofluoresce. Choroidal nevine melanoma, and this is really important. One of the beauties with this is if you look at this, you've got the standard background glow on the retina here of lipofuscin, but here we suddenly see this is as if somebody sneezed on the retina. Sorry to use that analogy, but it's just like that. And you've got this sort of globular appearance of lipofuscin. Now, if you can see that, straight away, you need to be looking at the very, very probable presence of a melanoma. And often, especially if it's an amelanotic melanoma, you may well see lipofuscin changes like this long before you can actually see anything going on a structural image. And many times I've referred patients with very early melanomas that hospitals have had to monitor to make sure that it is actually growing. And that's why lipofuscin can show you things so much earlier. You get other absorbing material. So when you look in the center here, you'll often find it looks darker in the center. This is the luteal pigment. Now, if the luteal pigment is missing, you will see hyperfluorescence in an area like that. And the last one on this little gap here is optic nerve head drusen. Now, that has to be optic nerve head drusen because you don't get lipofuscin in the optic nerve. So again, often these patients with sharp visual field defects, you might not see the drusen on a structural image, and often you might not see it on an OCT image through the optic nerve head either. But that hyperfluorescence within the optic nerve immediately tells you you've got optic nerve head drusen there. Some of the causes of hypofluorescence, well, the obvious one is geographic atrophy. There's no metabolic activity there, so there's no lipofuscin being formed. hereditary retinal dystrophies, so a lot of the rod cone dystrophies will all show hypofluorescence, and they also are very much characterized by a line all around the outside, very diffuse area of hyperfluorescence, a penumbra of hyperfluorescence, and RPE hypertrophy. So here's your classic sign of geographic atrophy here, and there's RPE hypertrophy. Now I'm going to come back to this one in a little while, but again, that's a classic sign of a chirpy there. And you often see some anomalies here, like retinoschisis. Now here, this looks as if it's hypofluorescence. In actual fact, the retinal pigment epithelium is still functioning well under there, but the fluid contained within that retinoschisis is actually very viscous, and therefore it actually appears dark like that. And then you've got a whole series of other things here. Now, we're going to cover these in case studies in future sessions as well, because we can go into those in a little bit more detail at the time. But again, fresh intra or subretinal hemorrhages will hypofluoresce, whereas old ones will hyperfluoresce. So again, the image can tell you some detail there. Luteal pigment, as I said, if it's dark, you've got a good density there. One of the first things I asked Optos when I was using autofluorescence is there any way they could use a grading of that darkness in there as a way of grading the density of luteal pigment in the centre? I think that was back in 2011, and I've not heard any more since, so I suspect the answer to that is no. Media opacities, we're going to come back to that again in a future time, because there's a very nice little sideline on autofluorescence which is very helpful. But I want to concentrate for a little while on macular degeneration, because obviously you can see from what's happening in the chemistry there, the retinal pigment cells play a very, very important role in the development of macular degeneration. But also autofluorescence also allows us to monitor the metabolic integrity of the retinal pigment epithelium. So you can see here, increased autofluorescence is often seen due to the accumulation of lipofuscin within the retinal pigment in these areas. Now, there's no hypofluorescence there, so this is a macular region that is stressed. It's saying, help me, do something, I need something done for me. And we'll look at that later on. But the geographic atrophy here, again, is due to the absence of lipofuscin granules in the retinal pigment epithelium, so you're just not getting anything there. And it is a prognostic marker for geographic atrophy, this autofluorescence, because this ring around the edge of geographic atrophy areas is very, very important. This 500 micron margin, the brighter that is, the more aggressive the geographic atrophy is likely to be. And you're liable to notice that increasing over time. So maybe there's not a lot you can do with the patient, but in actual fact, you can prepare the patient for what's coming. You don't have to sort of say to them, well, you're going to go blind, chum, tough. But you can prepare them in terms of how they prepare their lifestyle for that sort of thing. This is a lovely image from Carl Danzig here, and you can see this hyperfluorescent ring around the geographic atrophy area here. So very, very common. And that just brings me to a quick little adjunct. When you're going back over this this lecture, do have a look at the Beckman classification of AMD, because if you're going to use autofluorescent efficiently, you need to know where you are on the journey of macular degeneration because there's more treatments coming in now. In this country, we tend to talk of photobiomodulation as the main way forward as things stand. But in the States, there are now at least 2 injections that have been approved by the FDA for treatment of dry macular degeneration. And there's some very, very interesting papers to read on that and how it slows it down and everything. But these are your giveaways here. What you're looking at within the image gives you the idea of whether you're no AMD, early, intermediate or late AMD with geographic atrophy. So the Beckman classification is a very good classification to use for that sort of thing. Another useful tool within the Optos system is a measuring tool to measure areas of geographic atrophy. And you have this wonderful tool here, the auto grow region. And if you just click on that and put it over that lesion, it will find the edges of that lesion and it will give you an area marking. So this is really, really useful for progression analysis. And you can see here a set of images here. And because the geographic atrophy is so well defined in autofluorescence, you can very easily measure these areas. So this is 2021, and you can see how the area increases year on year. And you can see how these two distinct areas here develop out. And eventually by 2024, have increased there, and this area was about 1.0 something, or it's about 1.86 now. So you can see how over time you've got this progression within, and these are great images to use with patients in terms of trying to educate them to understand what's happening with their vision, but at the same time talking to them about what they can do in terms of their lifestyle approach to try and improve the metabolic environment, to try and slow this down, lessen this from happening. You can't guarantee by changing somebody's habits that they're going to get better or that they're going to slow down, but you're giving them every possible opportunity to do that. So I want to quickly mention here hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine screening, this paper came out in 2011 by these characters at the same time that autofluorescence was hitting the high street. I jumped on this straight away because the traditional, first of all, it was thought that hydroxychloroquine toxicity, bullseye maculopathy, was actually not that common. But then people began to realize that it was very much more common than we thought it was. And then it was decided we really ought to be screening these people far more frequently. And the screening basically said that you should be using visual field test, OCT, and wide field autofluorescence screening. Again, autofluorescence shows up stress within the retina long before you've got the structural damage of bullseye maculopathy. So what can you do with that? Well, you need to lessen the dosage of the hydroxychloroquine. And so it is really important to know what your patients are doing with hydroxychloroquine. And I very quickly introduced into my practice the hydroxychloroquine dose calculations. Now you can pick these up off the web anywhere. Just Google hydroxychloroquine dosage calculator and take your pick of the ones that come up. This, over the years, has served me so well in practice, and I think every optometrist should have one of these in their consulting room, because one of the first things that happens when you put a patient on hydroxychloroquine, one of the first things the GP will say is it will help your joints and your sort of pain management if you lose weight. And so many times I've seen patients who were one weight when they were put on hydroxychloroquine. They then lost weight, and as a result, their dose of hydroxychloroquine was way too high for their new weight. So we used to have a set of scales in the practice, and we would always weigh our patients on hydroxychloroquine, and we would throw their dosage and their weight into a dose calculator. And you can see here, this calculator actually gives you a retinopathy risk profile. And many times I would write back to the GP and say, you know, it's great, your patient's lost weight, super duper duper, but after all that advice you gave them on losing weight, they're actually going to go blind now because the dosage is too high. Please amend the dosage. And I used to get some wonderful letters back from doctors saying, thank you for pointing this out, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it's a great way of building relationships between you and the doc and you and the patient. And patients were so often completely gobsmacked that we had this facility. So if we're going to use autofluorescence, let's make full use of it by assisting the patient with a hydroxychloroquine dose calculator. Terribly easy to use, and a great way of keeping the doc informed of what's going on. So what I want to do now is just look at some case studies here and some different things that autofluorescence shows us. This is one of my favorite patients. I actually took this patient and another patient as a poster to the ARVO conference in Seattle a few years back, and then to the European Association as well the same year. And we were getting comments made there about, you can't do what you've just done. Well, we proved we could. This was a patient whose brother had gone blind with wet AMD. And he came to see me. He had noticed his vision was getting worse in his right eye. And this was the image we got straight away. Classic early dry type macular degeneration signs. And this was the autofluorescent image that we got. Now, this was the one I showed you earlier. You can you see that glow in the center there, that brighter region? But specifically, you've got specific hyperfluorescence. These are retinal pigment epithelial cells gummed up with lipofuscin. And there's no hypofluorescence, so there's no death there. This is just cells that are screaming at me, do something, help me. Now, this guy was overweight. He had a very poor diet. It was a very stable diet. You know, he'd have a Kentucky Fried on a Monday, pizza on a Tuesday, McDonald's on a Thursday, treat himself to a Burger King on a Friday. This was a bad diet. There was no good nutrient in it, and he smoked as well. And there was his OCT image, classic early dry type changes. So these patients, we sit down and we really read the riot act to them. We say to them, you must give up smoking. Smoking is one of the worst oxidizing things that can happen in the retinal pigment epithelium. The chemicals within there block normal metabolic function and increase the oxidation that's going on there. So you must stop smoking. And we know the strong association between smoking and macular degeneration. And we have a stop smoking advisor in the practice. If you're going to be serious about stop smoking, you really should have a stop smoking advisor in the practice. And if you haven't got one in the practice, know where your stop smoking services are in your local vicinity so that you can signpost the patient to them. Get them support. And these autofluorescent images are so good at showing people what is going wrong. And it doesn't half help them to understand. So he came back a few months later. He stopped smoking completely. He's made major improvements to his diet. In fact, he told me I was overweight as a result of it. So he's lost a lot of weight. His diet is now full of all the right things, the bright fruits, bright berries, broad green leaf vegetables. He's got a lot better diet. He's using dietary supplements because he had drusen at the macula in both eyes. Look at his visual acuity now. This is 5 months later. That visual acuity is right back up. We appear to have lost a lot of the drusen. Now, it could be because the drusen has regressed and he's got geographic atrophy there. But you have to say to yourself, well, would his vision actually improve if he'd got geographic atrophy there? No. So we look at the autofluorescent image. Look at that autofluorescent image now. Where's the hyperfluorescence on that? It's gone. The cells are now metabolizing efficiently. They have managed to get rid of lipofuscin because the metabolic environment is so healthy now. And I love that image. There's his OCT. This is a person where we have, through changing the metabolic environment in that macular region, we have reversed what was happening there. Don't let anybody tell you can't reverse early dry macular degeneration. And he's not the only patient we've demonstrated this in. And there's been a lot more work done since I did this work, and it has been shown. You can't guarantee it in every patient, and you never would attempt to guarantee it. But what we say to patients is, you've got to give your retinal pigment epithelium the best possible chance to metabolize efficiently. And this is the way to do it. This is the sort of things you need to be doing to get rid of the oxidative stress that's there and to increase the antioxidant power within your retinal pigment epithelium. And to this day, this guy still holds on to good vision in that eye. And I'm not going to spend a long time going through this, but this actually came out in 2015. And it's a beautiful flow diagram. It's still relevant nowadays. And do have a look at that because it's a flow chart as to what you should be doing with patients. And you'll see most of them are see advice 1, consider dietary modification. Late on, AREDS2 formulation medication, but in most people, we're looking at dietary modification. So here's a patient he's been discharged from hospital, chronic CSR. He's told all is stable, don't worry, go away. But when you autofluoresce, you see this classic damage done in that macular region. Again, CSR patients, they tend to be type A personalities. An awful lot of them smoke, an awful lot of them are very stressed, a lot of them have a very poor diet. These are people you need to work with. And again, when they see this, I used to say to them, what you want is that not there. What you most definitely do not want is that to turn dark, because that means that it's died. So it's under stress at the moment. Again, we've got to look at what you're doing with your lifestyle to try and get that area working best possible. And we used to get this a lot with patients who had been discharged and told they were back to normal. And actually nowadays, the local hospital autofluoresce images every CSR patient on discharge to see whether we've got hyperfluorescence there or not. It doesn't always work. This was a patient who, it was hand movements in his right eye. He's got geographic atrophy in his left eye. Notice the angioid streaks, by the way, crisscrossing the macula. He's got geographic atrophy there. We read him the riot act about smoking. He comes back a year later. He's still smoking. He hasn't really changed his diet, but he's telling me his vision's getting worse. And this was before we used to be able to measure, but that was his next image. And you can see the increase in the area of geographic atrophy. Now, one of the beauties about this image is you can sit there with these patients and you can read the riot act to them, and you just literally need to sit there and flick the screen backwards and forwards like that. And they can see that area getting bigger, getting smaller, getting bigger. And this is what they've done to themselves by not trying to be compliant with the best possible sort of diet and stopping smoking. And this guy went away, and this time he knocked his smoking on the head. And I'm pleased to say the next time we saw him, there was really no change, and he reported his vision was stable. So again, with these people, autofluorescence very starkly shows you what's going on there. Great tool for that sort of thing. Here's one of my favorite patients. Again, I think I might have mentioned him last time. We've got something going on down here. When we look at the autofluorescence, you see that classic globular appearance of lipofuscin on the surface of the retina. This is an amelanotic melanoma, and so many of these are amelanotic, so there's no pigment to give you a real guide. But as soon as you see the autofluorescence, the hyperfluorescence like that, looking sort of globular as somebody sneezed on the retina, you're into the land of melanomas. This is a more obvious one here. But again, if we look at the autofluorescence, you can see hyperfluorescence here, where the head of the tumour is pushing up. It seems to be stretching the retinal pigment epithelium, which is interrupting normal metabolic function. So you're seeing the hyperfluorescence here, but there is that globular-like appearance of lipofuscin on the surface. A very obvious sign that you've got a melanoma there. Now here's the chirpy that I talked about earlier. What you see here is a lot of very dark pigment in this lesion. This is melanin. And you've got a classic lacuna in here where the pigment has dissipated. And sometimes with late on chirpies, that pigment will dissipate completely, and all you'll be left with is a very thin black line, but the rest of this lesion will look perfectly normal. And so it'll just look the same color as the rest of the retina. You'd hardly know anything was there. But when you go and look at the autofluorescent image, that's what you see. Completely dark, because the whole area is atrophic. Even the lacuna, even that bit in the center, the whole thing is dark. So even if there was no pigment there, that would look completely dark. The simple reason is here you are looking at the structure of the retina. So the dark is the presence of melanin. So you're looking at the structure. Here, you're looking at the functionality. There is no functionality there. The whole area is dark. So excellent diagnostic tool there to help you differentiate between different types of lesion. So structure, function. Very, very clear example there. Here's a retinitis pigmentosa. And with the retinitis pigmentosa, as I say, you see this whole area where it's hypofluorescent, but with that hyperfluorescent penumbra around there. Now, this hypofluorescent area will very clearly correlate with a visual field image. So again, the hypofluorescence shows you the area that is non-functional. That will very much correlate with your visual field results as well. Here you can see some hyperfluorescence at the nerve head. There it is a year later, spread out much larger. What's going on? Well, this is a serous detachment of the retina, and this fluid is what you can see hyperfluorescing here. Remember we said about that right at the beginning. And you see it expanding out over time. So again, you can see the progression of that serous detachment slowly. Quickly, I want to mention cataracts. We'll come on to these probably on another occasion. This is an absolute sideshow to what autofluorescence is meant to be. I mentioned about confocal imaging managed to suppress the fluorescence of the human lens. Well, sometimes if the human lens changes, like in nuclear sclerosis cataract, the density of the lens gets much more dense, and probably due to a change in the refractive index, we get the lens glowing, and that lens glow blurs out the image of the retina. Now, we looked at this in the very early stages, and what we found is if you operate on a cataract like this, you find the amount of phaco energy that's required to break up this very dense lens is much higher than anticipated, and for a longer period of time. Now, you know, and I know with nuclear sclerosis patients, they just get more short-sighted, but they often retain very good visual acuity for a long while. But if you've got a patient who's got a corneal endothelial dystrophy, you do not want to be dissipating any more energy than you need to inside the eye. And if you are going to dissipate it, you want to be doing it for the shortest amount of time possible. So actually, there is a case to be made here with this patient that although the acuity may still be good, if they've got endothelial dystrophy, that poor image shows you the lens is actually very dense. And so you can make a very good case for early referral of these patients in order to stop endothelial damage. And we've done that on a few occasions, and the results have been very, very good indeed, because each time it's been justified because the lens was much more dense than the consultant thought it would be. So again, quite by accident, it's a very, very useful thing to use. Now, we're coming to the end here, but I want to share with you one of the great things about autofluorescence. This dear lady, she had been married to a childhood sweetheart. They got married about the age of 17, I think, and they'd been together their whole life. He died suddenly, and she was a grieving widow, and she was a very, very strident lady, very forceful lady. You can see she was very difficult to image. But this was her retina, and this was the view on autofluorescence. And we can see the amount of stress and damage that's going on in this retina. And this is going to progress to the macula. We know macular degeneration starts in the mid-periphery and the far periphery. These are patients you need to be able to talk to and sit down and coax and try and get them to get a good diet. This poor lady, she wouldn't eat anything. She had a terrible diet, and she wouldn't eat because the table she used to sit at, her husband would sit opposite her, and she couldn't bring herself to do that. Now, we hope these people get through the grieving process, but if in that time we let their maculas, to be quite blunt about it, rot out because we're not helping them with their nutrition and everything, then what chance do they have of coming back to a normal life if the macula has gone and they're now sort of sight impaired? So these are the people, we use these images and we talk to them very gently, we coax them, we get them back to the importance of eating so that when they come to that, you know, we've preserved their macular region. She was a lovely lady. We brought her around slowly. In fact, she collared me one time in Waitrose. She actually stopped me with her trolley full of beautifully healthy food. She actually rummaged through my trolley and pulled out stuff and said, "You shouldn't be eating that, Mr. Browning. You shouldn't eat that, Mr. Browning. That'll wreck your macula, Mr. Brown." She was a lovely, lovely lady. But it shows how we can use autofluorescence to show the functionality of the retina. And I bring this on up right at the end. This was a lovely lady again. She almost gave me a textbook image here. We've got geographic atrophy with wet AMD. We've got a choroidal hemorrhage. We've got an old subretinal hemorrhage. When we look at that in autofluorescence, you see the classic geographic atrophy. You see the bright hyperfluorescence around the edge. You see a completely different type of hypofluorescence from blood, and you see the classic hyperfluorescence of the old hemorrhages. So it's almost like a mini textbook of what the different types of fluorescence and hypofluorescence look like. So that's kind of it for tonight. I could go on for another 2 hours, but in conclusion, autofluorescence is a vital tool for ongoing protection of your patient's sight. It's essential that every patient image should have autofluorescent imaging because of what it's showing you. It'll reveal functional retinal changes, often long before actual structural change. And autofluorescent imaging is totally different to standard imaging. You're looking at the functionality, the fitness to function, as I call it. And it opens up vital opportunities to interact with patients at an early stage to preserve their vision. So once again, thank you for taking part. As I say, in future lectures, we're going to drill down into far more case studies and things like that as we go. So more of that as we develop the different things. But there we go. Do we have any questions at this stage?
So everyone's been very, very quiet in the chat, which is lovely. That means they've been paying attention and listening to all of the learnings that we could have today. I'm going to have to watch it again, quite frankly,
Thank you.
to make sure I take on
It's
board more.
just such a fantastic. I mean, the retinal pigment epithelium keeps me awake at night with wonder. That one layer of cells can do all of that. How important is that to keep these people, keep that functioning normally? So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you everyone for your attention. I'm just going to stop the recording now.